Okay, let's unpack this. Picture a massive, Fortune 500 company collapsing seemingly overnight.
Oh, like the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly, like a massive corporate giant that looked completely invincible on paper, only to just shatter into a million pieces because its underlying foundation was, well, completely hollow.
Right. Or if you zoom out even further, picture a centuries-old absolute monarchy.
Yeah, the ones commanding massive armies and just unimaginable wealth.
Exactly. And then suddenly crumbling into dust in the span of a single generation. It happens all the time.
It really does. And when we witness these massive structural collapses, we usually blame, I don't know, bad contemporary leadership or sudden economic shifts.
Or unpredictable geopolitical black swans, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what if the exact mathematical formula for their destruction was already written down and coded over 1,000 years ago in just a single solitary sentence?
See, that completely changes the entire paradigm of how we interact with ancient texts. Because the typical assumption is that when you open a religious scripture, you are basically reading a manual for personal piety.
Right. You expect the focus to be entirely on the individual's soul.
Yeah, completely divorced from the physical, tangible reality of things like macroeconomics or sociology or statecraft.
Well, today, in this deep dive, we are taking a sledgehammer to that exact assumption.
I am so ready for this.
We are examining an incredibly dense, highly structural analysis of just one verse. Specifically, we are looking at Surah al-Fatir, which is Surah 35 of the Quran, Ayat 10.
And we are looking at this through the lens of a sweeping, hours-long lecture delivered in 1980 by the scholar Allama Parvez.
Right. And our mission today is to explore how Parvez reads this one specific verse not as a spiritual platitude or, a nice thing to murmur during a prayer, but as a complete universal socio-economic blueprint.
Which is just a fascinating approach.
It really is. We are going to look at how he positions this single sentence as the ultimate internal audit tool for any civilization throughout history.
Basically, a formula outlining what causes a society to rise, and conversely, what absolutely guarantees its total systemic collapse.
Yeah. So what Parvez does here is strip away the centuries of purely theological, almost mystical interpretations that have gathered around this text.
Which makes sense when you consider the context. I mean, he lived and wrote during a time of immense geopolitical upheaval.
Right. The Cold War was raging.
Exactly. The dichotomy between hypercapitalism and state communism was defining the globe, and newly independent nations were trying to figure out how to build functional societies.
So in that context, he approaches the text not as a priest, but almost as a social engineer.
Or like a systems architect, yeah. He examines the verse as a highly compressed, rational code.
And once you understand the formula he extracts from this single sentence, you honestly start seeing its mechanics operating everywhere.
So let's jump directly into the first half of Ayat 10.
Yes, let's do it.
The structural argument Parvez is making hinges on a very specific phrasing. The translation reads, "To him ascends the good word, the kalimi tayyib, and the righteous action, amali sali, elevates it."
Okay, let's dissect those two variables. The good word and the righteous action.
Right.
To make this approachable, because I know the Arabic terminology can carry heavy traditional baggage, think of the good word, kalimi tayyib, as a world-changing startup pitch.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. It's the visionary slide deck. It's the promise of a better system that solves a massive societal problem. It looks phenomenal on paper.
What's fascinating here is taking that startup analogy a step further. The pitch deck represents the theoretical framework, the ideology, or, the constitution of a society.
The blueprint, basically.
Exactly. But as anyone who has ever worked in venture capital knows, a brilliant pitch deck is completely useless in a vacuum.
Oh, 100%. It's literally just pixels on a screen.
Or ink on a page. It requires grueling, unglamorous, highly coordinated execution.
The coding, the logistics, the marketing.
Yes, the hiring, the supply chain management, all of that. And that execution, that physical labor, is the righteous action, the amal sali.
So without the execution, the pitch deck just sits in a drawer.
And eventually becomes obsolete, yeah.
Yeah.
The words, no matter how visionary or good, simply do not rise on their own merit.
What I find so striking about Parvez's approach is how heavily he leans into the etymology of these Arabic words.
He really does. He forcefully drags them out of the monastery and into the marketplace.
Yes. For instance, the phrase kalimi tayyib. In a traditional, localized religious context, people might interpret a good word as just a declaration of faith.
Like a chant, or a prayer recited quietly on a rosary.
Right, you say the magic words, and you get some invisible spiritual credit deposited into an otherworldly bank account.
But Parwes argues that reading is fundamentally flawed.
Because it ignores the actual vocabulary of the text, right?
Exactly. The root of the word tayyib doesn't mean holy in a mystical sense.
What does it mean then?
It refers to something that is wholesome, productive, and possesses the inherent capacity to yield positive, life-giving results.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's actually often used in the context of rich, fertile soil or a fruitful tree.
So it's very grounded in the physical world.
Highly grounded. Therefore, a kalimi tayyib is a constructive, functional ideology.
It is a program for life.
Right, a system of equitable values, a socio-economic constitution that has the actual potential to improve the human condition on the ground.
So presenting a Kalimi Tayyib isn't just standing on a soapbox saying nice moral things.
Not at all.
It means presenting a functional, structurally sound blueprint for a society. It's the architectural drawing of a bridge, not a poem about a bridge.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And that leads directly to the second half of the equation, amali sali.
Which gets translated as righteous action or good deeds, usually.
Right. And again, the traditional mind immediately jumps to acts of personal piety.
Like fasting or giving a few coins to a beggar.
Yeah, but Parwes goes straight to the linguistic root of sali.
Which means what?
The root relates to repairing, making whole, resolving conflict, and actualizing dormant potential.
So it's constructive, tangible labor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Parwes uses a very grounded agricultural model in his lecture to illustrate the relationship between the two.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine the good word, this productive system, as a high-quality seed.
Okay, a seed.
That seed contains immense, almost miraculous potential. It holds the biological DNA to become a massive, fruit-bearing tree that can feed a whole community.
But what happens if you leave that seed in a burlap sack on a shelf in your garage?
Nothing happens. It remains a theoretical tree.
It might as well be a pebble. The potential is completely locked away by inaction.
Precisely. In order for that seed to rise, to literally ascend out of the dirt and bear fruit, it requires the farmer.
The labor.
And critically, it doesn't just require any random frantic action from the farmer.
Right, you can't just throw water at a wall and expect a tree to grow.
Right. It requires action specifically aligned with the unforgiving laws of agriculture.
The farmer must understand soil chemistry, plow the earth, plant the seed at the correct depth.
Manage the irrigation, protect the sapling from pests. All of that grueling, systemic, scientifically aligned labor is the amali sali.
So the good speech, the seed, is only as credible and only as powerful as the labor that backs it up.
Yes. The text explicitly states that the righteous action is what elevates the good word. The human being's labor is the mechanical engine of ascent.
Wow. That constitutes a profound philosophical shift.
It really does.
It means that claiming to hold a true belief system or a perfect ideology is functionally meaningless if it's not paired with the hard structural work of building the society that ideology describes.
Exactly. The ideology doesn't automatically elevate a civilization just because the civilization claims to believe in it.
The people have to elevate the ideology through their labor.
And Parwes is uncompromising on this point. He states that the ideology itself, regardless of how divine or perfect you believe its origin to be, possesses zero self-actualizing power in the physical world.
Because the universe does not reward good intentions, it rewards constructive action.
Exactly.
Wait, I need to push back on this quite strongly because we have to address the actual literal language being used in the text.
Okay, go for it.
If this is purely a socioeconomic law about building a functional civilization through hard work, why does the verse use such intensely spatial theological language?
You mean the part about ascending?
Yeah, it says the good word ascends to him, meaning ascends to God. If I'm a casual listener, I'm picturing an ideology physically floating upward into the sky toward a golden throne in the clouds.
Right, the spatial imagery.
Are we talking about a physical direction here? Isn't Parwes just performing massive linguistic gymnastics to make an ancient mystical text fit a 20th century socioeconomic worldview?
That is the crucial tension Parwes anticipates. And he spends significant time dismantling that literalist spatial view of the text.
How does he dismantle it?
He argues that this literalist reading the idea of a deity located in a specific spatial coordinate above the clouds is not just mathematically absurd, but it has historically led to massive philosophical dead ends.
Makes sense?
If God is infinite, God cannot be bound by time and space. Space implies a physical boundary, a limitation.
Right, and time implies change and decay.
Exactly. A being or force that is absolute is, by definition, outside of those constructs entirely.
So if there is no physical throne localized in a specific set of GPS coordinates in the stratosphere, what on earth does ascending mean in this framework?
That's a great question.
If my constructive ideology isn't moving up in altitude, where exactly is it going?
Parwes argues that ascending to God means moving toward the ultimate goal or destination that the divine system has set for human evolution.
Okay, moving toward a goal.
In this framework, God represents the absolute zenith of progress, justice, equity, and societal perfection.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, an ideology ascending to him means that this program, when powered by human labor, moves human civilization closer to that ideal perfected state.
It is an evolutionary ascent, not a spatial one.
Exactly. You aren't gaining altitude, you are gaining complexity, equity, and capability.
That makes the concept of ascent about human progress over epochs rather than a mystical elevator ride.
And Parwes uses a striking historical example from the Quran to cement this non-spatial reading.
What's the example?
He brings up the narrative of the prophet Abraham. When Abraham was facing intense political persecution and decided to migrate, the text quotes him saying, "I'm going to my Lord."
Okay.
Parwes points out the glaringly obvious geographical reality there. Abraham was migrating from one physical location in the Middle East to another physical location in the Middle East.
He was walking across the desert.
Right, he was not building a spacecraft to leave the atmosphere.
So when he says, "I'm going to my Lord," he's talking about migrating to a geopolitical environment where he can actually establish this constructive system.
Exactly. The direction of God is simply the direction of human progress.
This redefinition completely alters the relationship between humanity and the divine.
It does. And Parwes explores this by bringing in the philosophy of Allama Iqbal.
Who was a massive intellectual figure in the 20th century.
Huge. And Iqbal, analyzing this exact same Quranic framework, portrays humans not as groveling subjects waiting for handouts, but as God's co-workers or partners.
Oh, I love that phrase. Co-workers.
The specific Urdu and Arabic concept used is Rafiq.
Let's linger on this Rafiq concept because it feels like a radical departure from the traditional fatalism we often associate with ancient religious structures.
Very much so.
I mean, the idea of absolute predestination, where God does absolutely everything and humans just passively endure their assigned fate.
Right, sitting around waiting.
But in this reading, there's a strict division of labor. God provides the potential, the raw materials, and the immutable governing laws of physics and sociology.
And human action is the mandatory catalyst required to actualize that potential.
Yeah, Iqbal captures this beautifully in a famous poem structured as a dialogue between God and man.
Well, he does. God begins by saying, "I created the world from one dust and water, and you created Iran, Tartary, and China."
Which acknowledges that humans create the borders, the divisions, the societal structure.
Exactly. But then the poem moves into the industrial, constructive realm. God says, "I made the iron from the earth," and man replies, "I made the sword, the spear, and the arrow."
God says, "I made the night." Man says, "I made the lamp."
God says, "I made the clay." Man says, "I made the cup."
It's just a breathtaking piece of literature because it underlines the absolute necessity of the human hand in the evolutionary process.
It really does.
The iron ore sitting in the Earth's crust will never, not in a trillion years, spontaneously evolve into a forged steel blade.
No, it won't.
The clay by the riverbank will never magically form itself into a fired ceramic cup. It requires the deliberate intervention of human intellect and human labor, the amali sali.
God provides the raw iron. The human acts as the co-worker to smelt it, shape it, and utilize it.
And Parwes uses this exact dynamic to explain the classic problem of evil and divine in action, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He posits a hypothetical where people are looking at massive global injustice and complaining, why doesn't God just strike down the tyrants? Why doesn't a lightning bolt just fry the dictator?
A very common question.
And Parwes' answer, derived directly from the mechanics of Ayat 10, is that the mechanism to strike down the tyrant has already been provided.
And it is human beings.
You are the hands. You are the co-workers.
The systemic law states that tyranny is unsustainable, but it is the explicit responsibility of the human collective, acting in accordance with a constructive ideology, to physically dismantle that tyranny.
Sitting back and waiting for miraculous lightning bolt is an utter abdication of the role of the Rafiq.
He even brings up the historical Battle of Badr to solidify this. analyzing a verse that traditionally sounds incredibly mystical.
Right, the verse says something along the lines of, "You did not throw when you threw, but God threw."
And a literalist reads that and pictures God magically guiding arrows mid-flight.
Which sounds like a fantasy novel.
Exactly. But in Parwez's structural reading, it means something entirely different.
In a structural reading, it means that when a group of humans organizes themselves around a just, productive ideology, and they take tangible physical action against an oppressive force.
Their action becomes perfectly aligned with the evolutionary force of the universe itself.
Exactly. The arrows they fire are literal wooden arrows, fired by human muscles. But because those humans are executing the objective program of justice, their hands effectively act as the hands of the divine system in that moment.
It is the ultimate synthesis of the good word, combining with righteous action.
But if we are God's co-workers forging the iron, what happens to the timeline of history?
Right. Does human intervention actually change the speed of the universe's evolution?
That brings us to the accelerator effect that Parwez introduces, which is where his socio-economic theory intersects with the grand philosophy of history.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Parwez observes that the universe possesses an inherent evolutionary trajectory, moving towards complexity. Even without human intervention, raw materials change, species adapt, ecosystems shift.
Sure.
However, he notes the textual language used to describe that undirected natural evolution.
Right. The Quran describes this natural unfolding as taking a day, the measure of which is 1,000 years, or even 50,000 years.
Meaning natural, undirected evolution is excruciatingly painfully slow.
It's the difference between waiting for a random genetic mutation to make a plant slightly more drought-resistant over 10,000 generations.
Versus human engineers stepping in and selectively breeding or genetically modifying that plant in a decade.
Precisely. And this is the point Parwez makes, using the analogy of a modern agricultural nursery.
Right. If we wait for nature, via random probability, to optimize a specific flower bloom, it takes eons.
But when human beings apply their intellect, when they act as the coworker applying constructive action, they act as a massive temporal accelerator.
A plant that struggles to survive in the wild can be brought into a climate-controlled, scientifically managed greenhouse and forced to bloom perfectly in a fraction of the time.
The human being bypasses the 50,000-year timeline.
It implies that the speed of human progress is entirely dependent on our willingness to do the grueling work.
The blueprint for a perfect society exists. The raw materials are all in the ground.
Are we going to wait 50,000 years for things to slowly get better by chance?
Or are we going to build the societal greenhouse and achieve in a single generation what would otherwise take millennia?
That is the staggering power of Amala Salih when attached to a kalima tayyib. They collapse time.
But this immense power of human agency introduces the dark mirror of this entire concept.
Oh.
Because if constructive human action accelerates the rise of civilization, what happens when human intellect and agency are pointed in the opposite direction?
Right. What happens when humans build systems explicitly based on exploitation?
Here's where it gets really interesting.
I'm ready.
Ayat 10 does not stop at the formula for ascent. It immediately pivots to the inverse.
The verse continues. But those who plot evil, they will have a severe punishment, and their plotting will perish.
Or, depending on the translation, their plotting will come to nothing.
Now, based on everything we've discussed, I assume Parwez isn't reading severe punishment as fire and brimstone in the afterlife.
Not at all. He grounds this entirely in the socio-economic reality of the physical world. He introduces the concept of systemic recoil.
Systemic recoil. Okay, break that down.
The idea here is that reality itself, the universe, human sociology, economics, possesses a specific unbending architecture.
Right.
It is mathematically built to favor that which is productive, equitable, and serves the collective.
Therefore, any system built in direct contradiction to that architecture is inherently unstable.
So when the text talks about those who plot evil, it's not describing, cartoon villains twirling their mustaches.
And their punishment isn't a divine plague.
Right. It's that their plot fundamentally violates the physics of societal stability.
Looking closely at the Arabic word used for plotting mocker, it often translates to deception, fraud, or a hidden scheme.
Interesting.
Parwez frames this as systems that desperately try to pass themselves off as the good word, but are structurally designed to extract value rather than build it.
There are elaborate systems of fraud.
Let's use a modern historical parallel to really cement how this systemic recoil works in practice. Think about the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, perfect example.
The good word, the outward ideology, was a beautiful narrative. Home ownership for everyone, expanding the American dream, financial innovation.
That was the shiny pitch deck.
But the actual mechanics of the system, the subprime mortgages, the predatory lending, the slicing and dicing of toxic debt into AAA-rated securities was pure extraction.
It was McGruck. It was deception.
And how did that system perish? It didn't require an asteroid strike.
It collapsed under its own weight because it was parasitic.
A parasite can thrive incredibly well for a short period, gorging itself on the host. But eventually, if it extracts too much, it kills the host. And by doing so, it mathematically guarantees its own death.
Wow.
Systemic recoil is the inevitable process where an extractive system consumes its own foundation until gravity asserts itself.
It's fascinating how Parwes looks at the geopolitical landscape of his time, the unrestrained capitalist models on one side, the autocratic regimes on the other, and diagnoses them entirely through the lens of this ancient text.
And we should pause here to be very clear for the listener.
Good point.
We are just objectively reporting Parwes' specific socioeconomic views on these systems. We are taking a political side or endorsing his critique.
Right, absolutely. We are simply trying to convey the ideas contained in his original lecture.
Exactly. So back to his argument. He makes a highly specific economic argument here, that systems prioritizing the hoarding of resources by a tiny elite over the collective ascent of the population are structurally parasitic.
He argues that these systems carry the seeds of their own destruction embedded in their very design.
Like building a towering skyscraper, using subpar, watered-down concrete to maximize profit.
And then trying to mask the structural rot by covering the exterior in a beautiful, glittering glass facade.
The facade is the maker. It looks spectacular for a decade. But eventually, the fundamental architecture of reality, gravity, load-bearing physics cannot be tricked by glass.
The concrete fails and the building collapses into dust.
The collapse isn't a magical punishment from the sky. It's the inevitable physics of bad engineering asserting itself.
And Parwes points out that history is a graveyard of these exact systems.
The pharaonic empires, absolute monarchies, colonial powers built on the violent extraction of resources.
They might maintain the illusion of stability for centuries through sheer force, but eventually they perish.
They come to nothing because they are misaligned with the evolutionary trajectory of the universe, which demands the equitable flourishing of humanity.
And perhaps the most insidious part, which Parwes astutely highlights, is that as these extractive systems begin to feel the tremors of their own collapse, they often try to co-opt the language of the good word to save themselves.
Oh, they definitely do. They ramp up the formalism.
They dress their exploitation in the robes of patriotism or piety or corporate social responsibility.
They chant all the right slogans while doing the exact opposite. But the verse is terrifyingly absolute. The plotting will perish. Reality cannot be tricked by PR campaigns.
Which brings us to a massive methodological question regarding this entire deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me.
We have just spent a significant amount of time unpacking an immense, hyper-dense civilizational theory.
We really have.
We've covered the nature of God being outside of space and time, human evolutionary acceleration, the systemic collapse of extractive economies via parasitic recoil.
All of that.
And Parwes is deriving all of this from one single sentence in an ancient text. Why did he dedicate an entire hour-plus lecture to just one verse? I have to ask, is this immense density genuinely a feature of the original text? Or is this just a modern 20th century intellectual aggressively projecting his own socioeconomic anxieties and political theories onto a religious document?
This raises an important question, and it is the absolute central debate surrounding rationalist scholars like Parwes.
It's the exegesis versus eisegesis problem.
Exactly. How much of this is exegesis drawing meaning out of the text, and how much is eisegesis reading your own preconceived ideas into the text?
How does he defend it?
Parwes defends his methodology by asserting a fundamental premise. The Quran is not merely a book of moral suggestions or disjointed spiritual proverbs.
Okay.
He argues it's a highly compressed, cohesive law system.
So it's less like reading a novel and more like reading a mathematical proof or a constitutional document.
Yes. Think about the equation E=4. It's just 5 symbols on a chalkboard.
Right, but those 5 symbols compress the physics of the entire universe, the relationship between mass, energy, and the speed of light.
That analogy perfectly captures Parwes' approach. He argues that when the text speaks, it is laying down universal, immutable laws of sociology and history.
Therefore, a single statement like, the good word ascends only through righteous action, carries immense civilizational weight because it is a fundamental equation of human behavior.
If it is a universal law, then it must apply consistently across time, space, economics, and politics.
It's like a constitutional clause. The Due Process Clause in the U.S. Constitution is incredibly brief, yet thousands of volumes of legal theory, Supreme Court cases, and societal structures are built entirely upon those few words.
So he's looking at this verse as the due process clause for human civilization.
He's saying, if this equation is true, if this is a fundamental law of physics for societies, let's run the data of all human history through it and see if the math checks out.
And according to his extensive historical analysis, the math checks out perfectly. When you synthesize the two halves of this single verse, the mechanics of ascent on one side and mechanics of systemic recoil on the other, you derive what Parwez considers the ultimate test of social legitimacy.
It is a foolproof litmus test you can apply to any government, any ideology, any corporation, or any social program in any era of human history.
The legitimacy test. It cuts through all the noise, all the propaganda, all the marketing.
You look at a human program and you ask a very simple set of questions. Does the system produce? Does it build tangible infrastructure?
Does it actualize human potential and serve the collective equitably?
Does it possess both the visionary good word and the grueling righteous execution?
If the empirical answer is yes, the law states it will rise. It will accelerate human evolution.
But if you look at a system and ask, does this system extract more than it produces?
Does it rely on deception and magnanimity to hide its true mechanics?
Does it suppress human potential to maintain the power of a few?
If the answer is yes, the law mathematically dictates it is an evil plot, and the inevitable, inescapable outcome is systemic collapse.
It might take a year, it might take a century, but the concrete will eventually fail.
That is why Parwez devoted an entire lecture to just one verse. Because if you truly grasp the mechanics of this one formula, you understand the engine of human history.
You possess the audit tool to evaluate the legitimacy and the future trajectory of the very society you live in.
You don't need 1,000 pages of complex legislation to predict the future. You just need to understand the mechanics of ascent and the inevitability of systemic recoil.
So what does this all mean for us today? We started this deep dive with a single ancient sentence, Surah 35, Ayat 10.
And we've unpacked what Allama Parwez sees as a complete, unified economy of human action.
On one side of the ledger, we have the formula for accelerated evolution, the good word, the productive ideology, the high-quality seed, the visionary pitch deck.
But we learn that this word is incredibly heavy. It possesses zero buoyancy on its own.
It requires the righteous deed, the constructive labor, the equitable execution, the grueling, scientifically aligned work of the farmer.
Good word plus righteous deed equals ascent.
It equals humans acting as the Rafiq, the co-worker, actively forging the iron and compressing 50,000 years of natural struggle into a single generation of progress.
And on the opposite side of that ledger, we have the warning of the evil plot. Systems built on extraction, fraud, and the hoarding of resources.
These systems are structurally unsound. They attempt to defy the fundamental architecture of reality.
And because of the unforgiving law of systemic recoil, they are absolutely guaranteed to consume their own foundations and collapse into dust.
The universe simply does not tolerate parasites forever.
This one verse functions as a universal diagnostic tool, stripping away the comfort of passive belief.
You cannot simply hold the right opinions, tweet the right slogans, or say the right prayers and expect progress to occur. The universe demands action.
You are the co-worker. If the tangible work of building an equitable society is not being done, the ascent stops immediately.
The timeline stretches back out to 50,000 years.
Which brings us directly to you, the listener.
Yes, we've spent this time talking about the rise and fall of massive empires, the philosophy of Allama Iqbal, and the grand span of evolutionary epochs, but this formula scales all the way down to the micro level of your daily life.
Look at the systems you operate within every single day. Look at the corporation you work for.
Look at the community organizations you dedicate your time to. Look at the local government initiatives in your city.
Are they relying on good words floating upward on empty hype, marketing jargon, and hollow mission statements?
Or are they anchored by the heavy, constructive, transparent, day-to-day action required to actually make them rise?
Are the spaces you inhabit genuinely building toward ascent, creating tangible value for the collective, and accelerating human potential.
Or underneath the glossy brochures and the reassuring speeches, are they quietly extracting, exploiting, and mathematically plotting their own inevitable systemic collapse?
The structural blueprint has been placed in front of you.
The diagnostic tool is in your hands. Take a hard look at the systems around you. Are you building the greenhouse, or are you just waiting for the concrete to fail?